You've used the term intelligence and brain and vision in relation to computers and computer programs. And these are terms that I feel get mentioned without there being a universal agreement upon what it is that they're implying.
Mm, hmm.
So
Right.
for me, when you say that something has a brain, I immediately imagine an organism or a system that is not only capable of learning, but it's capable of innovating, it is capable of coming up with novel solutions to things. But oftentimes, when I talk to people who work on computer programs, it comes down to the fact that there's a training set for a specific stimulus, and then the computer can work within that stimulus, but it's never going to suddenly develop an ability to look for a new stimulus unless you
Right.
specifically train it to do so. Is that the programs that you're using are when you said that they have a brain, when you say that they can see, what does that actually mean?
Right. That's a great question, and also, and the question of like, what is a brain? So I mean, I walk in a couple of different disciplinary circles, some with physiologists, some with behavioral ecologists, some with engineers, and depending on which group you're in, the significance of having a brain varies. And so you to some of the people that I work with, a brain really has to mean that decision making is centralized in an organism. So, when is it useful for there to be a central center of decision making? And so, whereas there of course are theories out there about animals. A lot of animals have brains, and plants maybe don't, because animals have to move themselves around, and plants are planted, and animals are animated, and so you need a central area to coordinate the motion of all of these things. And that actually, fits with things like when we look at ants. There's a lot of ephemeral brainness in ants, and so I mentioned bees, for example, are highly related to ants. That there's when they move from one nest to another, only 20 bees out of thousands know where the new nest is, and so and those 20, once they hit the new nest, fold back into the rest of them and stop being the kind of, the migration bees. So it's like when temporarily, when you needed to move everybody, then there was suddenly a group that took control, moved everybody, and then disintegrated back into the background again. Um,
So the brain is
so
like the embodiment of the decision-making process?
I would say that yeah, like sometimes we say, what is a brain? And I would say a brain, it would be a centralized location for information processing, where most of the important information gets to, and most of the important decisions are made and then actuated from. And then but then that so that's the reason I love looking at bio. So as an engineer, I love looking at biology for looking at all sorts of exceptions and diversity. So not every animal even has a brain. There are some that have nerve nets, for example, that are a little bit more distributed and things, and yet they still manage to do. So that's it comes back to the question of when do we need a brain, and if I were to translate that engineering, then I can say when do we need like so right now there's a lot of work in engineering and computer science on so-called federated learning. So, there was a big push to put everything up into the cloud. So, for the longest time, when I was in grad school and engineering, the people would say, how are you going to have the computational power to do that? Like somebody would present their dissertation and it would show some really interesting results on autonomous cars or whatever. And then there inevitably be somebody would raise their hand and say, how long did it take you to generate that trajectory? And they'd say, oh, on my super powerful desktop machine, it took a week or something. And that was a trajectory for one drive, that was supposed to happen in the morning of, some car or whatever. And they'd say, well, how do you expect that to scale? Like, what? And then people would always then say, well, it's in the cloud. So eventually, you'll just be able to put it in the cloud, and it'll happen instantaneously. Or
Sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
that's right, exactly right, right. Yes, you're counting on magic. And for a long time, that's where everything went. And then people started realizing that although we could make magic in the cloud to some extent, maybe we don't want to be giving the magician all of our biometrics or all of our details and
Hmm.
things like that. And so now federated learning was sort of this idea that okay, we're going to take everything away from the king and kind of concentrate power in the states. We're going to create kind of this federated thing where out on the edge is where we're going to have the computing, and so we're going to do a lot of information processing on the edge, and then send anonymized things as needed back to a central area, and then get anonymized stuff back from it. And so that way we could somehow still gather information from across the globe, but we would still keep most of the fine grained details localized. And so like once you get into these sorts of architectures, then it is hard to say like, well, where is the brain in that machine? The brain seems like an abstract idea that is implemented on a substrate that is spread all over the place. And so
I think that paradigm's kind of shifting in biology too, though. The more that you look at, especially the involvement of the gut and goes, the gut feeling, and honestly, there are all sorts of immune decisions being made all throughout your body. So
absolutely,
it's interesting how that idea of the brain is kind of dissolving, especially the more we understand the immune system and the way that it interacts with the nervous system.
Right, and I think that's a great point, and that's why. So for me, like I said, I travel in a bunch of circles, but I mean, the one area of biology that's close to my heart is behavioral ecology. And in behavioral ecology, there is a fundamental distinction between mechanism and function, and on the side of that, also between mechanism, phylogeny, ontogeny, development, and function, and so sometimes when I have to ask somebody, what do you mean by brain? I have to ask them effectively, are you referring to brain as function or brain as mechanism? So there's that wet hunk of matter that's underneath my skull, and you can ask questions about it, but those are mechanistic questions. Or like you just said, effectively you can ask functional questions about information processing, and we can refer to that as being a brain colloquially, but really we're talking about something function. I know in neuroscience, there are people that are now debating this like for a long time. So cognitive sciences have sort of asserted that there are modules in the brain that do not necessarily relate to true, to true structures that actually exist in there. Like this is an attentional area. There must be a module for emotion, these sorts of things. And we just sort of take them for granted that these things actually exist. And I think to a behavioral ecologist, they would say, well, like it seems like you're mixing function and mechanism. And I'm now starting to see conversations in neuroscience where they're actually calling for people to be more formal about these things and say, don't refer to an attention center of the brain, refer to attention as a function, and then tell me about how different mechanisms in the brain contribute to that function. But we can study those as separate entities. And so I guess I would apologize for using the word brain earlier. I guess it was just convenient. But I think it's a very deep rabbit hole to really say, when we talk about the brain in conversation, what are we really getting at? And that comes back to my last point there. Are we getting at a function or are we getting at a mechanism? And once we're clear about that, then maybe we can have more intelligent conversations.
I love that. Yeah, it's a huge problem too. I think at the cutting edge of physics, confusing material with effects, especially things that we understand and harness so well in engineering, because oftentimes the functional description, the quantitative relationships are sufficient to be able to develop pretty powerful tech without actually concerning yourself with the material actors involved. And so it's cool to hear it laid out that way.
Although, it's interesting you bring up engineering. I mean, so I teach a lot of engineers about how to create intelligent things and all that, and how to compare to biology. And it's interesting to me that the conflation of function and mechanism, I feel like, is still very strong in engineering, even though engineers have to build things, because they will assume that the things they built to do the thing they're going to do always do that thing. So you assume, like you could say, well, how do I make this robot find a light source? And I'd say, well, follow a photo gradient or whatever. And so, and so they build some mechanism that causes the robot, hopefully, to move toward a light source. And they will just assume that like they might even implement some form of gradient calculator inside the brain, inside the central processing of the robot. And just because it's calculating a gradient doesn't mean that gradient is actually the physical gradient.
It's just the output from whatever your photo resistors are telling you or whatever.
Right. Or even if they've got some sophisticated mathematical model that filtering the photo resistors through, like the little CDS cells go into a model which estimates the actual gradient, and then they get a numerical value of the gradient, and they try to climb that gradient, and they'll tell me, no, it's climbing a gradient. I programmed it to climb a gradient because it estimates a gradient and climbs that thing. And say, well, most of the time, you'll be in an environment where the gradient inside the head of that robot will be the gradient in the physical space. But that need not be the case.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you just happen to build a mechanism that's pretty darn good at its function, but I bet I could put it into an environment where we would get really confused. And so we have to be clear that just because you wrote gradient climbing into your code doesn't mean it's actually going to climb a gradient.
And what are the conditions under which you would take a robot that has been programmed to climb a gradient and confuse it sufficiently for it to not do that?
I mean, so you could maybe in a mirrored area or something like that. I've got colleagues who, I've got a colleague who he does a lot of work with computer vision in autonomy, specifically big monolithic robots and cars, and he really believes that it's important for you can't just train a neural network to do computer vision, that you really need a knowledge backend as well, and those two things can kind of work together. And that's in order to make sense of weird things in the world. And he brings up these points to, like, if you took most autonomous vehicles, that are driving, in test, like I live near Tempe, Arizona, and Google drives a lot of its own cars around, or Alphabet, Waymo drives a lot of its cars around, and you see these cars driving around working fine. Imagine if they pulled up behind a car that, and this is an example I borrowed from him, that just had a giant mirror on the back of that car. That would be weird to me if I pulled up to it, but I would suddenly realize that I was looking at me and it was looking at a mirror, and I could deal with that. The autonomous vehicle, now granted, it has more than just vision sensors, but if you just focus on the vision, that's going to totally upset the vision system. So that's kind of an example where you really, like, the mechanisms that work under a non-mirrored world are going to be totally broken under a mirrored world, and yet mechanisms in my brain seem totally fine with that.